speak with you today. I appreciate the opportunity. So as Kayla mentioned, I'm a wildlife health specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment. I'm also a veterinarian. I've been working in this field for a number of years now, but in in Saskatchewan here for the last 4.5 years. And prior to that, I year in working for the government of the Northwest Territories and also the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife before moving back to Canada. So over the years, I've been involved in a variety of different wildlife health issues, involving a variety of species, ranging from rabies in raccoons to chytrid fungus in amphibians. So today I wanted to share with you some of my perspectives on managing wildlife health and give you a few examples of some of the challenges we're dealing with as far as managing disease in wildlife populations. So I'll go ahead and see if this is working here. There we go. So I think it's important that we sort of revisit or think about how the definition of health has evolved over the years. So historically, in the early 1900s, prior to that period, health was merely defined as the absence of disease. Now that definition was updated by the World Health Organization in the 1940s. To encompass a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And so in the human health realm, at least, this definition was defined to be a little bit more holistic in our understanding. However, in the wildlife health field, that we've been a little bit slower to change, and really up until recently, really the focus has been on wildlife disease and remains to be on wildlife disease. However, we are, as you know, facing unprecedented challenges in the 21st century, and there's this understanding that the definition was in need of being updated. And so in 2014, Dr. Craig Stephen, who was the CEO of the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative at the time, came up with an updated definition of wildlife health. And that is the result of the interacting biologic, social, and environmental determinants that promote and maintain health as a capacity to cope with change over time. So this is a much more holistic view of health. So understanding that in order to address the many challenges that wildlife face and the many stressors, we need to look at the capacity of both individuals and populations to respond to disease, to many other determinants and stressors in their environment. And it's this balance at the end of the day between the vulnerability and the resiliency of these populations, and health finds itself somewhere in that balance between vulnerability and resilience. And so there are many determinants of health, and these are all these factors that can impact the capacity of individuals and populations to survive, to maintain healthy, to reproduce. So things like habitat change, landscape changes, the availability of resources such as food and nutrition, the use of chemicals or pesticides. All of these factors ultimately impact how populations are able to thrive. And some of these stressors compound to, in some cases, manifest themselves in disease. And disease itself can be both a determinant and an outcome of all of these adverse health factors. And so really, in order to understand, to better manage wildlife populations, we need to look at all of this in concert. So today I will be talking and focusing on management of wildlife diseases, which is still something that we focus a lot on. But I want us to kind of keep this in context as far as understanding that there are a lot of different factors to consider. So we'll kind of keep that in mind as we move forward through the presentation today. So there's also a concept that has been gaining traction over the last several decades now that you're likely undoubtedly familiar with, and that's this concept of One Health. And so this is the idea that the health of humans, animals, and the environment is interconnected. We understand this is this is true and has been for a long time. Unfortunately, Western science is just kind of catching up with this concept. And it's interesting because here in Saskatchewan, we work a lot with Indigenous communities, and we understand that Indigenous people have understood this concept for much longer than we have in sort of the Western science field. But undoubtedly, we understand that, we need to maintain healthy ecosystems and environments in order to maintain healthy wildlife and people. And certainly, many of the challenges we've been facing in recent years, including coronavirus, the recent pandemic, sort of reflect that as well. So it takes wildlife management and wildlife health management takes more than just veterinarians or human medical doctors. It takes social scientists and biologists and general members of the public, whether you're working as an educator or you're an agricultural producer. All of us have a vested role in this concept. So one thing that's important to highlight that you've all been hearing a lot about, and that is the emergence of infectious diseases, which has been significant over the last several decades now. The image there was published in an article in 2020, just highlighting some of the emerging and re-emerging diseases that have arisen over the last several decades. So you've heard of Zika virus and West Nile and Ebola virus, highly pathogenic avian flu. We recently had a monkeypox epidemic as well. So what we know is that majority of these diseases, emerging infectious diseases, are zoonotic or transmissible to people, and 72%, so approximately 3/4, are believed to originate in wildlife. And so there are certainly implications of the emergence of infectious disease to people, food security, things like the economy and biodiversity loss. And I guess I should preface this by saying there are many drivers. What are the drivers for this emergence? And it's things like globalization, so globalized trade, the movement of animals and animal products across the globe. We're seeing intensified agriculture in certain areas of the world, live animal markets. We see encroachment on wildlife habitat, or increased contact between livestock animals, domestic animals, and humans. And all of these factors or determinants have resulted in this emergence of infectious disease, which we're seeing. SARS-CoV-2, the virus responsible for coronavirus, is a perfect example. There are a number of circulating theories as to the origins, most recently in the media. But one of the prevailing theories remains that the virus originated in wildlife. There are a number of coronaviruses circulating in wildlife populations. It's believed this virus, many others originating in wildlife, were transmitted to humans through live animal markets, so sort of intensified operations where there's very close contact between wildlife and humans, also domestic species. Once the disease spilled over into the human populations, it quickly became transmissible amongst humans and spread globally. And now what we're seeing is the spillback into animal populations. So the disease has now since been detected in over 25 different species in 35 countries globally. And that includes domestic species, domestic pets, such as dogs and hamsters, but also white-tailed deer, even including here in Saskatchewan, where we've seen it in our wildlife populations. So lots of elements there to consider as far as what we're sort of dealing with in the wildlife health field. So in terms of the management of both disease and wildlife health, why do we want to manage for disease or health in general? And if you're a veterinarian like myself, or maybe you're a biologist or wildlife ecologist, the first is probably what sticks out most in your mind, and that is this desire to conserve wildlife populations. And that's why a lot of us went into this field. So this idea of impacts to biodiversity, the role of wildlife in our general well-being and culture, and the health of ecosystems as a whole. However, that is not always the driver for management. It's not always where the resources are and the funding. Human health is often a major driver of management, and why a lot of wildlife agencies manage for disease in wildlife populations. And so there's these concerns related to the emergence of infectious diseases, zoonotic potential, so potential for spread to humans. And I would add also, we are hopefully starting to recognize the role that healthy wildlife populations play in our collective well-being, not just physically, but also our mental and our emotional health as well. So human health is paramount. Also, the impacts on livestock and domestic species. So certainly the agricultural economy and also the availability of healthy food, which is something that we're all very dependent on. So often that is a driver for our impetus for some of the management actions as well, and impacts on livelihoods of the producers that play a role there. So there's many reasons we manage for wildlife health or disease. There are three major facets of disease management, or it's a way to sort of break it down to look at it, especially in terms of disease, and that's the idea of prevention, control, and eradication. If we had the choice, prevention would always be the most important tool, and that is preventing the disease from being introduced into wildlife populations in the first place. We understand that once disease is present in wildlife populations, it's really difficult or impossible to eradicate. Globally, there's only been a few diseases that have ever been eradicated, and that's smallpox in 1980 and rinderpest, which is a virus related to measles in cattle. That's also, it's been a significant challenge to livestock production and also impacting wildlife populations in Africa, and that disease was eradicated through both diseases through aggressive vaccination campaigns in 2011. So rinderpest was eradicated at that time. But of course, that is not an option for most diseases or issues that we deal with. So often we end up with focusing on control measures to either reduce prevalence or minimize the spread or impacts of disease. And we'll talk about that in a more holistic context as well. So not just in terms of management of the disease itself. But I think one important take-home point is that wildlife management agencies, so I work for the Ministry of Environment. So just to provide a bit of context, provincial and territorial governments or wildlife management agencies are responsible for the management of sustainable wildlife populations ultimately. So we bear that responsibility. There is, wildlife is held in what's called the public trust. So it doesn't, the idea is that wildlife doesn't belong to anyone in particular, it belongs to everyone. And so wildlife agencies are sort of entrusted with maintaining those populations. So, but of course, things are complicated. And yes, governments are more reactionary. So often we do focus more on control rather than prevention, which is ultimately a lot more challenging and difficult. So another way of looking at wildlife management, or sort of a simplistic view of infectious, particularly this. So this is a concept that was developed for infectious disease. It's called the epidemiologic triad, and it's this idea that there are three elements that are needed in order for disease to occur. However, this could also be applied to other outcomes, not only to disease. So you need a susceptible host, or potentially a vulnerable host or population, a suitable agent, and a suitable environment for those or conditions to allow for disease to occur. And so we often look to this when we think of management and how we might manage wildlife populations. And so just a few examples here of what that might look like. So when we talk about controlling disease or health outcomes in wildlife populations, look at each of these elements. So for instance, in terms of a host, if we can somehow alter the susceptibility of the host, so potentially through vaccination, that has been tried. For instance, efforts to control the spread of raccoon rabies in Eastern Canada and the United States. In many cases, we do not have this option available, and especially on a large scale when you're talking about wildlife populations. We can remove the host itself, so removing infected individuals from a population, or depopulating a wildlife population to try to eliminate the risk or the disease. Manipulating the agent, in some cases, this could also include vectors such as mosquitoes or ticks. So things like incinerating carcasses, or incinerating the soil to eliminate bacteria or viruses, or spraying for mosquitoes to eliminate vectors. And then various environmental manipulations, which is quite broad. So we could be looking at things like fencing to limit contact between livestock and domestic species, to limit transmission, restricting the movement of animals from one area to another, removal of carcasses that could also pose a risk of environmental contamination. So we often think of it in this context, but I think it's also important that we consider the social environment, which is another element that maybe historically we haven't thought as much about, but it's really important, specifically from a provincial wildlife management perspective. And so those are the social, political, economic factors that will impact the outcomes. So the effectiveness of the management itself, as well as the acceptability or acceptance for the various management actions that might be undertaken. So we often undertake this analysis looking at the level of risk, the associated costs, and the feasibility of management, and ask ourselves a number of different questions. So things like, what are the consequences of the management itself? Because management is not without consequences, right? I mean, we're trying to limit risks, but there will be outcomes that will maybe be adverse outcomes for some groups. So who will be adversely impacted? What's the likelihood that we're going to be successful? What are the risks if we do nothing? And yeah, the associated costs, which often can be limiting for us. So I wanted to, within that context, just kind of highlight a few examples of some of the wildlife health issues and diseases that we're managing here in Saskatchewan currently. And so we'll kind of go through that and look at it in that context. So the first example is of chronic wasting disease. And the question is, why is wildlife disease management so complicated or so challenging sometimes? And it's a question I ask myself all the time. And I think chronic wasting disease is a really ideal example, just because it is such a complex issue. And there are so many different variables and potential stakeholders impacted. So I'll kind of go through this one first. So many of you are undoubtedly familiar with chronic wasting disease. For those of you that are not, so this is a neurological disease that affects members of the deer family. So here in Saskatchewan, that's mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk, moose, and caribou. It's caused by an infectious protein called a prion, which is both highly infectious and also highly persistent in the environment. So it can persist for anywhere from years to decades, which makes it extremely challenging to manage. And ultimately, it causes fatal brain degeneration, and the animals eventually do succumb to the infection. And it's a disease for which we do not have a vaccine or cure. So this is not a disease we can eradicate through a vaccination campaign. How did CWD arrive, or when did CWD arrive in Saskatchewan? We first detected it in the late 1990s on several captive game farms. It's believed to have been introduced with the introduction of infected elk from a game farm or game ranch in South Dakota that was later found to be infected. Those animals were traced to a farm in Lloydminster that had later shipped animals at that time. By the time it was traced back to over 30 additional game farms in the province. And that year, 2000, when it was traced back to that farm, was the same year we found it for the first time in our mule deer in the same area. So since then, the disease has spread considerably. And currently, we are seeing some of the highest rates of CWD anywhere in the world, so here in Saskatchewan. So in our mule deer population, this is just a map showing some of our infection rates, and we have rates exceeding 50% in areas of the province. Here in red, South Saskatchewan River Valley is where we have some of our highest infection rates, as high as 80% in our male mule deer population, as high as 52% in our female population. And at those rates, we expect to see population level impacts, and we are starting to see those impacts on our mule deer populations, and that is cause for concern. So of course, the impact to wildlife populations is an important consideration here. There have now been studies in 3 of our major ungulate species that have demonstrated CWD to be a population-limiting disease. So these studies are out of Colorado and Wyoming, where the disease was first detected and has existed since the 1970s. In those studies, they found that at populations where they had prevalence rates over 30%, they saw decreased population growth and decreased survival of the adult females. And the researchers concluded those populations are not sustainable or would not be sustainable in the long term at the current harvest levels. So clearly that's a concern, especially given that the rates in Saskatchewan exceed those that we're seeing that were here at the time these studies were conducted. There is also some question as to, so we have seen it in moose and elk in the province as well. We do not apologize, there's a bit of background noise here. Got some ATVs here at the hotel, so apologize for that, or snowmobiles. I'll try to speak up here. So yeah, we do not have enough data on moose populations, but we have seen mortality and clinical disease in moose here in the province as well. There are also concerned about threatened and endangered species. So we have threatened populations of caribou here in Saskatchewan, and we are starting to see CWD cases in the southern boreal forest here. So as far as the very southernmost regions of the boreal forest, and that's of course a concern for potential to spread to threatened boreal caribou. As far as human health is concerned, the risk of human health is still considered low. There have not been any documented cases in humans. There have been some experimental studies in other species, including rodents, ferrets, and certain species of monkeys that have demonstrated infection. But it appears, at least under natural conditions, the disease still seems to be transmissible to members of the deer family. However, as a precautionary measure, the World Health Organization and Health Canada do recommend that hunters do not eat meat from animals that are known to be infected. And so even though the risk is considered low, the concerns remain amongst the public. And so food safety is still a paramount concern amongst hunters and Indigenous communities. And that's something that we also need to manage as well. So there's a variety of social economic impacts to consider. So this is just an example of a few years ago when we had food donations that were turned away due to concerns regarding food safety risks, and also I have an image there just to demonstrate the impacts or potential impacts on Indigenous communities that rely on wild game meat as a form of sustenance and important culturally as well. So what are the management considerations? And there's quite a few of them. I sort of went through these. But there's of course the impact to the wildlife populations themselves, and that's something that we're concerned about. There's potential for introduction into threatened species such as boreal caribou. There are concerns regarding Indigenous food safety and security, and potential impacts on the economy as far as participation in hunting and tourism, especially in some of these really highly infected areas where we see really high infection rates. So we've done some consultation, and it looks like a majority of our stakeholders and Indigenous right holders feel like doing nothing is not an acceptable option. And so in that regard, what can we do? So first of all, there's a number of different challenges we're considering as far as factors that might impact transmission on the landscape. So there's a lot of ecological factors that are important here. So things like the fact that we have, especially in the winter time, we have deer congregating around feed sources, and Saskatchewan is a highly agricultural province. There's a lot of attractants on the landscape, including livestock feed, things like grain bags, grain bins. So we see animals congregating in those areas. There's also bait sites that are put out by hunters that also congregate animals, increasing transmission rates. The movement of carcasses across the province by hunters. We have operational game farms in the province, and a number of those farms are infected, which also can impact risk of transmission, as well as land use changes. So we are seeing potentially changes in distribution and density of deer in certain areas of the province where historically there may have been lower densities of deer in those areas. So things like forestry practices and other land use changes. So all of these are really complex issues that are happening on the landscape. So in terms of management, what are our options? Well, we can target management around any of these options. And so things like reducing agricultural sources or agricultural or hunting sources of feed, things like bait, reducing the movement of carcasses, impacting harvest to remove infected animals. So again, trying to reduce the number of infected animals on the landscape. And then minimizing disease spread from game farms through things like restricted movement or double fencing. And so based on a scientific approach, there is validity for these methods, but we need to ask ourselves a few different questions, that some of which we might not have answers to, like how likely are these methods to be effective? How feasible are they to implement and enforce? What will be the impacts on various stakeholders and rights holders, and the costs? So some of those questions are really going to be paramount in determining what we ultimately do. And so I think looking at these photos here, you can appreciate that the implications of management, or the risks, first of all, as well as the implications of management, will be different depending on whether you are a game farmer that relies on their livelihood based on so game farming, or whether or not if you're an Indigenous hunter who relies on wild game meat as a form of subsistence, as a way of life. You have a very different perspective, right? Same with, for instance, if you're a hunter and you've been using bait your whole life, or potentially for multiple generations, or an outfitter that relies on their income from clients that are coming in to hunt from other jurisdictions. You might also have a different perception of potentially the impacts of some of these restrictive management options, like restrictions on baiting. If you're a grain producer, you might, you have may have concerns over wild deer in your grain fields and eating from your grain bags. There might be implications and difficulties and challenges in terms of how you might manage that yourself if you're an agricultural producer or a livestock producer that's putting out feed for their cattle. So lots of different stakeholder perceptions, and I think those are all the things that we don't often think about when we think about wildlife health and disease management. And so it's this idea that we're not just managing wildlife, we're also managing people. And ultimately, it's not just the scientific scientific evidence that's going to be used to make those management decisions. It's also going to be largely dependent on the awareness of and communication of risk, whether the general public and stakeholders and the politicians themselves are aware of the risk, the cost and feasibility of implementation, the concerns of the various stakeholders, and at the end of the day, the political will. And so biologists and veterinarians like myself, we can make the recommendations, but ultimately it's going to be the decision makers that are going to be factoring all of these, elements into their decision making. So I wanted to move on to talk about another wildlife health challenge we've been facing here in the province. And that's white nose syndrome. And so this is a slightly different issue with different complexities and maybe a bit less complex than CWD as far as the stakeholders impacted. But just wanted to highlight that managing wildlife health is not always managing the disease itself. So white nose syndrome is a fungal disease that affects bats. It was first discovered in a cave in New York State in 2006. It's caused unprecedented mortality in hibernating bat species across North America, believed to have been introduced originally from Europe to naive populations of bats in North America that had not previously been exposed to this fungus. It can cause more than 90% mortality in hibernacula, responsible for a mortality of millions of bats to date. And has continued to spread. So since that time, 2006, it's continued to spread westward across North America at a fairly steady rate. And so a few years ago, we had in Ontario, a couple of years ago in Manitoba, and most recently detected in Saskatchewan last summer for the first time. We had a bat that was found weak and lethargic in Grasslands National Park in southern Saskatchewan, and that bat was confirmed to have died of white nose syndrome. So there's concerns. So this is a disease that we know does not impact other species other than bats. It is a threat to hibernating bat species, and we do have a number of threatened species here in the province, the little brown and the northern myotis. And there are a couple other species in the province we suspect are also susceptible. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what the risks or implications are. And in this case, we're looking at, of course, the impact as far as significant decline in bat populations, which we've already been seeing across North America. Bats are a fairly diverse order of species, similar to rodents, one of the highest diversity of species globally. So this would represent a significant loss of biodiversity. But also what's very important is that bats play a very important ecological role as natural pest control. So they eat vast quantities of insects and provide services in the billions of dollars to the agricultural industry as well. So there is some concerns over the potential impacts on the economy as well as their cultural and aesthetic value. And so in terms of managing disease, we have to ask ourselves a number of questions. First of all, whether we can manage the disease itself, right? And we'll come to that. But what tools do we have available? So in this case, as for CWD, there is no vaccine or treatment. There are some researchers that are working on that, but we don't have anything like that available or able to disseminate at any meaningful way or rate. Are we likely to be able to control spread? Very unlikely, considering the disease has continued to spread unabated since its first discovery. How can we reduce the risks of transmission to vulnerable populations? So there may be incremental things we can do, such as we can provide guidance for individuals that are working with bats, pest control operators or rehabilitators. We can ensure that they're not inadvertently spreading disease, but ultimately, is that going to have a positive impact on the populations as a whole? It's unlikely to have any significant impacts. So then we sort of refocus and think about, okay, well, if we can't control the disease itself, what can we do? And can we help these populations recover? And if so, how? And so what we've identified is that we actually have very little understanding of bat populations in the province. We don't have any known hibernacula in Saskatchewan, and very little information on critical roost sites or maternity roosts for these animals have their pups and raise their pups. So our approach has been to focus on both identifying and protecting critical habitats so that we can allow for population recovery. So rather than focusing on disease itself, we're going to be focusing on the habitat here to try to identify critical sites that these bats are using. In order to do that, we're relying on a citizen science campaign to identify additional maternity roost sites, and also looking at various models to try to predict where bats may be hibernating, and putting out bat detectors to see if we can identify hibernacula sites across the province. And so that's been our approach in this particular case. And the last example today is on highly pathogenic avian influenza. We are currently experiencing a global outbreak of H5N1, highly pathogenic avian flu. And so I want to talk about this idea of risk reduction and trying to minimize risk, particularly in cases where we are not able to eliminate the hazard that we're dealing with. So just a quick bit of background. So avian influenza viruses are naturally circulating in wild bird populations, predominantly in shorebirds and waterfowl, and typically do not cause significant disease in wild bird populations, at least historically. The original strain of H5N1 arose in a region in China in 1996, and that's probably when you first heard of avian influenza in the media. This arose on a domestic waterfowl farm, and the disease spilled back or spread into wild bird populations. Now, the highly pathogenic designation refers to the fact that the highly pathogenic bird flu, it causes significant mortality in poultry. Most of the strains circulating in wild birds are low pathogenic. So in this case, we had this highly pathogenic strain that arose in this domestic flock in China, spilled back into the wild population, and that virus has since evolved and has moved around globally, initially spreading to Asia and Africa and Europe, and there's been various reassortments and novel strains of the virus. So it's made its way into Europe and most recently into North America. The image there is of some of the wild bird migratory flyways. And you can see there's some overlap in these. So you can see potential for movement, birds and associated viruses across the East Atlantic flyway, across the Atlantic, and also across the Pacific. And that is how the virus is believed to have been introduced into North America. So prior to 2014, 2015, we had not really experienced any highly pathogenic outbreaks in wild birds, and that's been changing. So the last outbreak was in 2014-15. It persisted for about a year and died out, but very different to what we're experiencing today. So this most recent North American outbreak, the first detections were in an exhibition farm. They had some ostriches and some waterfowl and various species of birds on this farm found to be infected with mortality, as well as a few black-backed gulls from Newfoundland. And the virus is believed to have come across the Atlantic from Europe. It had been detected in Europe earlier that year. In February, we had detections across the East Coast. And then to March, we saw it across the Atlantic coast into the United States as the virus moved southward, and then sort of moved its way westward and northward with the spring migration. So in March, we had detections of mortality in North Dakota, and knew we'd be seeing it soon in Saskatchewan. In April, we had our first case in snow goose, and throughout the month of April and May, we saw significant mortality numbering in the hundreds of birds. So maybe not significant from a population standpoint, given our flocks of snow geese number in the tens of thousands of birds. But we were seeing hundreds of dead birds and had over 500 reports from members of the public. Multiple species impacted, so waterfowl, shorebirds, raptors, and scavenging birds, and most of these other species appear to have been infected through the consumption of infected waterfowl. So during this period, we also saw significant impacts on the poultry industry. So in Saskatchewan, we had 32 poultry farms impacted that were depopulated. Over 300 farms across Canada, and that's amounting to almost 4 million birds, and agricultural impacts in the millions of dollars to the agricultural industry. So very different in that we've never previously seen a highly pathogenic avian flu virus, at least in North America, that was causing persisting in wildlife populations and causing such significant mortality. And while it may not be an issue for the snow geese because of their numbers, it might be an issue for threatened species of birds that are much more limited in their population size. So the other interesting sort of evolution and what's been happening here is we've been seeing cases in mammals as well. So all these animals, the birds and the mammals, are exhibiting neurological symptoms as well as respiratory symptoms in some cases. Last spring, we had a number of foxes and skunks exhibiting neurologic symptoms that were found to be positive. And now across North America, it's been found in a variety of species, including grizzly bears, black bears. We had some seals, dolphin, some mink, and all confirmed to be infected with this H5N1, and we believe that they were likely exposed through the consumption of infected birds, potentially. In most cases, other than the seals, and that might be more of an environmental contaminant. We're not sure. But it does raise the question as far as the zoonotic potential of this disease. So now there's been novel reassortments and mutations found in these mammalian cases that raise questions and suspicion as far as the potential for the disease to be spread to humans. So it's important to take a precautionary approach here. So again, we need to consider, who will be impacted. So potentially here we've got impacts on wild bird populations, but more significantly, we have impacts on the agricultural industry, the poultry industry, and potential zoonotic potential, which is something we need to consider. Can we eliminate the risk? Well, given the virus is circulating in wild bird populations, we're unlikely to eliminate the risk. So what can we do in that case? And what tools do we have at our disposal to control the disease in wildlife, poultry, or in humans? And so we need to look at all of those things collectively. And again, we're going to look at a few different groups of people who might be impacted here. So again, this idea that, at the end of the day, we're managing humans as much as we're managing wildlife. So we've got, the wildlife rehabilitator who's potentially handling infected birds coming in through the rehab center. We have the backyard poultry producer, or maybe a commercial poultry producer whose income is relying on these birds, or maybe as a form of recreation, now potentially looking at having their flock depopulated, or the general public, the backyard bird fanciers. This is such a very predominant hobby, and these may be the people that are, the predominance of the general public that has a vested interest in the health of wild bird populations or concerns related to this disease. So all of these different people might be impacted in very different ways, and we need to think about how we can mitigate risks for all of them. And so there's an approach that's been lately gaining some recognition and traction called the harm reduction approach, and this is taken from human addiction management. So we understand that we can't always manage addictions or eliminate drugs or hazards to people, but we can try to mitigate the risk, and it applies equally well in the wildlife health field. And it's this idea that in the cases we can't eliminate the risk, we can at least try to reduce the negative consequences. And we can help both populations and individuals cope with the existing threats that we're facing. The approach also prioritizes goals that are achievable within our current state of knowledge and circumstances. So we might not have the answers. We might not have a vaccine or a cure. We might not even know if a specific management option is going to be 100% effective. But based on what we do know, we can do things to try to minimize that risk. And so it very much focuses on trying to, have these achievable goals and focus on those. And also within that context of One Health, where, we really are looking at working across the spectrum for all the people that might be impacted, and including wildlife populations as well. So I'm not going to exclude them here. So in this context of avian influenza, our goal here in harm reduction is to minimize exposure and risk of cross-species transmission. So how do we do that? Well, we can work with farmers to enhance their biosecurity on farm, enhancing precautions to limit access of wild birds to their farms, working on things like disinfection protocols, limiting the amount of people that access the farm, public outreach through social media, through regular media, to try to raise awareness for hunters, for the backyard bird hobbyists, things like disinfection, personal protection, and we work with all the stakeholders, wildlife rehabilitators, and those that might be in contact with infected birds, again, to encourage monitoring for symptoms, enhanced biosecurity at their facilities, and sharing health data with the Ministry of Health so they can follow up with some of these individuals. And so we're not able to necessarily control the spread of disease in wild bird populations, given how widespread it is, but we can try to minimize the risks to the various groups that might be impacted. So this idea it was recently published as well in this book, Animal Health and Society. And this concept that harm reduction really helps people make choices and changes that increase their capacity to manage the many complex factors that influence their health outcomes and to create healthier environments. And that makes a lot of sense. So how we manage the risks and how we respond is ultimately going to impact the outcomes as far as the health of our environment and our wildlife populations and our ecosystems. And so really at the end of the day, sometimes that's all we can do, is to increase and improve our capacity to do that. So as far as managing wildlife health, it does take an integrated approach. It's obviously often very complex and difficult, and can be very costly, if even possible. For that reason, prevention is often our number one priority, although unfortunately, we need to shift in that direction. We're not always there early enough to be able to do that. And obviously, as we've seen with the emergence of infectious disease, there's a lot of issues globally that need to be addressed. So we need to do that incrementally, right? One little bit at a time. We're not always going to be able to control or eliminate the risks, but we can try to minimize the negative impacts. And those are impacts to wildlife, to human health, to the environment. And so that's sort of where focus lies. So with that, I think I'll end there, and I will leave it open to questions. If folks have questions, and always feel free to give me a call or email if you'd like to chat, or have anything else you'd like to ask. Thanks. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ika. Yeah, if anyone's speaking with a question, go ahead. I thought I heard someone. Okay.
Yeah, it's just kind of a broad question, but if there are people who want to do what you do, what would you suggest they get involved with? What would you suggest kind of path they take? Because you have a very interesting and unique job, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because there are so many different ways to get to doing what I do. So it started for me with a passion for animals, which is why I went into veterinary medicine, but you don't need to be a veterinarian to work in the wildlife health field. Folks with a biology or ecology background sometimes are much better equipped than I am. So I rely very, very highly on some of those individuals that I work with that have such a really good understanding of population dynamics and population health. I think, conferences are a great way to get your foot in the door. That's worked really well for me. So some conferences like the Wildlife Disease Association, getting involved. And there's often student chapters, also Wildlife Society. I know probably folks are involved with that. And there's chapters of Wildlife Society. So actually getting to know folks that are already working in the wildlife field or wildlife health field, and looking for opportunities, whether it's a summer project. Often folks are looking for someone to volunteer, trying to make those connections. So that's always, I'd say number one is making connections. As far as background, I think having some background in biology, ecology is really great as a starting point. And then just diversifying your interests by connecting with others who work in the field. But yeah, it doesn't have to be any traditional route, I worked in small animal practice for a number of years before I got here, but it's veterinary medicine is a wonderful profession, but I'm very fortunate to be here, but I don't want to discount that. You can have we're like looking for folks that have experience in GIS and human dimensions. One of our biologists is a human dimension specialist, and she's been wonderful. So, wildlife health is all encompassing.
Awesome, thank you.
I guess I have a question. Do you find the public is generally receptive to prevention measures that you want to implement or control measures that you want to implement, or are they more hesitant to that control?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the situation. So it varies quite a lot. So certain things like, we weren't sure if passerine birds would be impacted by this avian flu pandemic. So we had recommended, disinfection, or at some point not even putting out bird feeders. And there was quite a lot of pushback around that. But, varied levels of support. Yeah, and to be honest, we don't always do a great job working with the public. Often we are very focused on working with specific stakeholder groups like hunters and trappers. So yeah, I think that's a hard one to answer, just because sometimes there is a lot of pushback. There's going to be more pushback if someone's livelihood is dependent on it. Otherwise, I think folks are generally supportive if you provided them with really good rationale. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi, I have a question. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, super. Okay, so thank you very much for the talk, you guys, really great. My question is about CWD, and you mentioned how that infectious prion can persist in the environment for a long period of time. And I'm curious how that long-term persistence, how that might change your disease management strategy.
Oh, that's a really good question. And it is actually changing our disease management strategy. So what we're finding in areas where CWD has been present for a long time, and environmental contamination is likely very high, we're seeing that epidemic curve, you call it the COVID curves, right? It's going up pretty exponentially. And so in those areas, we might be very limited in terms of what we can do to slow the spread. So in fact, we're looking to focus more on areas where there's so far less environmental contamination and rates are much lower. Yeah, for that reason. So we might be shifting our approach in terms of where we prioritize management, just based on the fact that there's little at this point we can do about the environmental contamination.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, if no one else has any questions, this is your last chance. Start typing or start talking. Okay, seeing none, I think we can wrap up there. Thank you so much, Iga. That was a really great talk, really informative. I really appreciated you being able to do this over Zoom. I'll just give a quick plug for our next seminar, which is on March 17th, and that'll be Mitch Wiegman talking about the utility of quantifying individual and population processes for conservation. So hopefully to see everyone back on March 17th, and thank you so much again, Iga. It was really great.
Yeah, thank you all for organizing, and yeah, it was great. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks. Bye. Andrew, I will be likely posting this talk on YouTube, so it should be on our YouTube channel. There was a direct question to me. Thanks, everyone.